All right, we'll be starting the session. To start the session, I would like to invite the chairperson and the judges, starting with Dr. Vivekanand Warkar, sir. So very good morning. Dr. Sunil Ratilal Morkar, sir. Sir, very good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Good morning, Padam. Yeah.
Yes. I think the other judges haven't joined yet. As they join, we'll just they'll be joining us in the session. So, sir, we'll start the session. I would like to request you to please introduce the first speaker, and we'll start the session, sir. Over to the chairperson. Dr. Vivekanand, sir. So, would you please introduce the first speaker?
अगर उस दिन करोगे तो फोन करोगे तो कोई फायदा नहीं है ना, मुनी आइडियली तो पहले करना चाहिए ना। कोई फोन नहीं कर रहा है, दैट इज द प्रॉब्लम। अभी दो पेशेंट, चारों पेशेंट को कॉल किया, इमीडिएट फर्स्ट ट्रीट में ये जा रहा है, एक पेशेंट तो बात भी कर रहा है और अभी वो एक पेशेंट वापस फोन कर रहा है।
Sir. Okay, let's start with our first speaker. I would invite Dr. Diksha Thorat to please share the screen and start the presentation.
Yes, so welcome to for this interesting session for the screen today. So I would like to invite Dr. Diksha Thorat for her first presentation. So Dr. Diksha, over to you.
Hello, good morning. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, you are audible. Yeah.
A very good morning to everyone. I'd like to thank AIOC for this opportunity. My topic for today is, does stereoacuity improve in children? As we know, strabismus comprises of 1 to 4% of the population, and if left uncorrected, it has various detrimental effects such as cosmetic, psychosocial. And along with that, it has effects such as decrease in binocularity, decrease in visual acuity due to strabismic amblyopia, decrease in motor dexterity, reading speed of the individual. It has been observed if constant concomitant strabismus is managed appropriately during early childhood, significant gain in binocularity and stereopsis can be obtained. Recent studies indicate that binocularity and stereopsis may improve in these patients, even if they're treated later in life, provided they are managed well. Therefore, we decided to conduct this study to evaluate the extent of improvement in stereopsis with strabismus after surgical management and its association with different types. Our study comprised of collection of data in 3 steps. The first step comprised of collection of demographic data and BCVA, cycloplegic refraction. Stereopsis was measured using Lang stereoacuity type 2 and Titmus fly test, and strabismic measurement was done preoperatively using Prism bar cover test. The second step was strabismus was treated surgically using recession, resection, transposition, plication, etc. And the third step was strabismus measurement and stereopsis measurement repeated after 1 month and 3 months post-operatively. This retrospective data included 220 eyes of children between the age of 0 to 18 years with strabismus, which consecutively underwent strabismus surgery with stereopsis evaluation pre and post-operative. Data was reviewed from EMR and analyzed with SPSS 22, where p-value of less than 0.05 was considered statistically significant. Here are the results. The first graph shows the effect of strabismus correction on stereopsis. Out of the 220 eyes that were enrolled, we can see 112 eyes lied between the group 40 to 80 seconds of arc post-operatively. The second graph shows the effect of age of onset of strabismus on stereopsis. It was divided in 3 groups, 0 to 5 years, 6 to 10 years, and 11 to 18 years. As we can see, the group 11 to 18 years showed a significant improvement in stereopsis between 40 to 80 seconds of arc. This table shows the post-operative stereopsis in different varieties of strabismus. Out of 157 eyes, which were orthotropic, from out of the 220 eyes, 104 eyes achieved stereopsis between 40 to 80 seconds of arc. This graph shows the effect of alignment on stereopsis, where orthotropia were significantly higher as compared to patients who had deviation post-operatively between 40 to 80 seconds of arc. Therefore, mean post-op correction of strabismus improved stereopsis to 400 seconds of arc from 800 seconds of arc. Constant type of strabismus has significant improvement in stereopsis where p-value was equal to 0.00. Post-operative alignment is associated with stereopsis. Children who presented late for correction showed more improvement in stereopsis post-correction. Ordenius et al. Found that achievement of stereopsis was significantly correlated with age of onset of strabismus and not with duration. We had similar observations. In our study, we found that after strabismus surgery, 71.6% patients achieved satisfactory surgical alignment and showed a better stereopsis. Fawcett et al. Also noted that stereopsis is more if the patient is orthotropic postoperatively. To conclude, good stereopsis is achieved after surgical correction. Stereopsis is associated with age of onset of strabismus and
Sorry
earlier.
to interrupt you. Your time is up. You need to conclude. I'm really sorry for this.
Okay, no problem. Stereopsis is associated with post-operative alignment of the eyes, and the closer the patient is to orthotopic states after treatment, the higher the chances of the patient developing good stereopsis. Thank you.
Over to the judges. Judges, any comments? Any questions?
Yes,
Yeah,
so
hi.
I think that is a good presentation, Dr. Diksha. So what is the new you want to add in the literature with your study?
Right, so there have been previous papers that have been published regarding the improvement of stereopsis. But actually this we went on and actually tried to find out analytical evidence of improvement in stereopsis on the basis of improvement in central macular thickness as well as RNFL and its effect of stereopsis on these. But actually that was not the that was out of the scope of this part of the presentation. So I couldn't include that here.
Okay, and which type of strabismus you found, is more worse for, the improvement of stereopsis? Because it was like you have written others, right? So in your subgroup analysis, probably.
So sorry, sir, I cannot hear you. So from what I took from the question, so we found out that exotropia, as compared to the other types of strabismus, had a better improvement in stereopsis, but it wasn't statistically significant. So we couldn't include it. The p-value of that was 0.44.
Yeah, one more thing is like, the conclusion of your result is that, those patients who presented late for, the correction, they had a better improvement in stereopsis. So how do you explain this?
So rather than the improvement in stereopsis, we found that the final outcome of stereopsis of the older children was better as compared to the final outcome of stereopsis of the other groups. One of the confounding factor of this could be that the younger children are unable to give stereopsis as compared to the older. But this was the statistics that we found in our study. So I had to present it.
Okay, that's interesting. Thank you. I think time is up. So
we'll move on to the next speaker.
Yeah, so I would like to call the next speaker, Dr. Sovita Rath, the surgical outcomes of infantile exotropia. Is Dr. Sovita around? Yeah.
Good morning, everybody. Is my screen visible?
Yes, it is visible, ma'am.
Yes, we can see your screen.
Respected judges. So I would be talking of our study, surgical outcomes of late surgery in uncomplicated infantile exotropia. So as we all know that infantile exotropia is a rare disorder characterized by divergent strabismus, which appears between 6 to 12 months of age and persists beyond 6 months of age in neurologically healthy children. Most of them would need eventually surgery, and timing of surgical intervention and its outcomes are less reported. Post-operative successful alignment is reported to be 60 to 85% of the cases, whichever paper has studied it. But the debate continues whether to operate early, which is less than 2 years of age, or at a later age beyond 2 years of age. Proponents of early surgery say that this would enhance the chance to attain binocularity, satisfactory ocular alignment, and reduce the risk of recurrence. However, authors who agree for later surgery, say an early surgery would give us an inaccurate measurement, thereby leading to a smaller overcorrection, which would cause monofixation syndrome and would have poor stereopsis or higher chances of amblyopia. Also, it has been studied that there is more risk of postoperative drift when operated at less than 1 year of age, and therefore the debate continues, controversies linger. So with this, the primary objective of our study was to review the motor and sensory outcomes after surgery for infantile exotropia, and the secondary objective was to study whether any preoperative variables affected these outcomes. It was a retrospective study designed between the year 2010 to 2016, in which we included children who presented to us with an onset before 12 months of age, exotropia deviation more than 25 prism diopters, whether they had a constant nature or of intermittent nature, which became constant later. And we excluded any other association like neurologic, preterm trauma, significant refractive error, consecutive exotropia, or any orbital pathology that would reduce vision. In these 30 children operated by a single surgeon who would have a minimum follow-up of 6 months were included. Surgical approach, which we did with either bilateral lateral rectus recession or unilateral recess resect. The motor outcome variables were quantified at success if esotropia less than 5 pt or exotropia less than 10 pt, recurrence if XT less than 10 prism diopters, and overcorrection of ET less than overcorrection of ET greater than 5 prism diopters. Binocular sensory status was also assessed using Worth-4 dot and Titmus stereopsis chart. And here we see that the age at presentation was 45.61 plus minus 27.67. So this was a later age of presentation, and the distance angle was ranged from 25 to 120 prism diopters. And most of them were operated at a mean age duration of 59.3 plus minus 27.05 months at a wider range of 24 to 151. 3 of them, due to dense amblyopia, underwent recess resect, and the rest of them had 27 of them had bilateral lateral rectus recession, of which at 6 weeks follow-up, 80% motor success was attained, which was maintained to at least 69% at 6-month follow-up, and 40% of them attained greater than 400 seconds of stereopsis at 6 months when it was recordable, and BSV was found in 20%. When we performed tests to find out any preoperative variables association, it was angle, the distance and near angle, which were correlated between the motor and sensory outcomes. So what does the literature says? It says that in the past, which are studies from the Western literature, says that most of them have operated at early age, and this gives us better postoperative outcomes. What we found that at India, children come at a later age, and even operating at a later age gives us good motor outcomes, and a good gross stereopsis can be attained. They have also studied in the past that duration of misalignment is a stronger predictor, whereas our study says angle of deviation is a significant predictor of outcome. There was no significant difference in clinical characters between constant and intermittent groups, except postoperative stereopsis in the papers reported, and this was similar to what we found was postoperative sensory outcomes were better in the intermittent group of infantile XT variant, and other factors did not influence outcomes. Thus, to conclude, it is better to aim for slight overcorrection. This group would have a higher rate of recurrence and overcorrection. Surgical dosage or the age does not affect the postoperative outcome. Our study definitely is limited by its retrospective, smaller sample size, and shorter follow-up duration. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Rath. You are pretty on time. So, what was the stereo acuity measurement? I am sure it was for near and not for the distance.
Yes, sir.
As you got, the 40% improvement in the stereopsis.
Yes, sir. It was for near, and as also discussed in the past speaker, so which we have also thought that because we have operated at a later age and older children, the response is reliable. That is why possibly it is better response for stereo.
Okay, Dr. Mayur, do you have any comment?
Hi, I'm Dr. Sunil. Sunil.
Oh, sorry, Dr. Sunil. Yeah.
Mayur is my brother. So I had this question about the angle of deviation. So could you say a particular cutoff point at the angle of deviation where we would be able to tell the patient's parents that beyond this angle of deviation, the issue is going to be there's not going to be a major improvement or something like that? Is there any cutoff angle were you able to find?
For surgery, we have included beyond 25, like because those, as we all know, that is a target for an operable angle.
So were you able to say that at a particular, let's say 30 or something else, were you able to say that at this point there is going to be a significant non-improvement? or less than this, there's going to be a
So
significant.
larger angle, those, sir, so if I have the individual 30 files, which I remember, so those who have larger angles, say more than 60, because we know they would have many, they did not have good outcomes, but still 30 to 40 in between that variant had a better outcome.
Right.
So
you would say beyond 40, you would be able to tell that may not have, and 60 is
May not.
definitely, 60 is definitely. So you would be able to classify that way, right?
yes, sir.
Yes.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Yes, so thank you. Let's move on to the next speaker, Dr. Venu Muralidhar.
Sir, I think Dr. Venu is not here. We have to move on.
Yeah,
Hello?
she's around. Yeah, she's around. Yeah.
She's here. She's here. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Ma'am, please share your screen.
Yes. Good morning. Am I audible?
Yes, please go ahead. We can see, make the PowerPoint mode for your presentation. Yeah.
Yes. Good
Yeah,
morning.
go ahead.
I thank the IOC for this opportunity. I'll be presenting a case of pyogenic granuloma, a tricky complication to treat post-squint surgery. So a 5-year-old girl was diagnosed with 45 prism diopters of esotropia and scheduled for strabismus surgery. She underwent left eye medial rectus muscle recession 5 mm and lateral rectus muscle resection 7 mm via limbal conjunctival incision. Muscle secured with 6-0 vicryl and conjunctiva was closed with 8-0 vicryl sutures. A combination of moxifloxacin and dexamethasone eye drops was instilled in the left eye 4 times a day for a week and then tapered for another 3 weeks. She was orthophoric and the post-op course was uneventful with a healthy wound and a minimum congestion at the end of 1 week. Now, after 3 weeks, the patient presented to us with a yellowish mass at the area of overlying the lateral rectus muscle in the operated eye. It was a 10 by 11 mm non-tender solid swelling, soft to firm in consistency. There was a mild conjunctival hyperemia, but no signs of inflammation as such, like, periorbital edema, erythema, discharge pain, systemic manifestations like fever, etc. The patient was put on systemic amoxicillin and clavulanic acid and topical eye drops, moxifloxacin hourly, and then taken for incision and drainage of what looked like a subconjunctival abscess because of the yellowish color and consistency. The specimen sent for microbiology showed inflammatory cells and methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. The patient was continued on systemic and topical antibiotics. In fact, the swelling and congestion did start to subside. But on the day 4, there was a recurrence of swelling at the same site with localized congestion, as we can see in the picture. So we started the patient on injectable vancomycin for 10 days, followed by linezolid tablet for 5 days with topical fortified vancomycin eye drops 4 times a day and dexamethasone 0.1% 4 times a day for 2 weeks. The patient had a gradual resolution of swelling. Fortified vanco was continued and dexamethasone was tapered, and the swelling, as you can see, resolved completely by the end of 1 month. So the recurrence of swelling and its pinkish fleshy consistency and appearance made us speculate. And after some research, we found a case report with similar features that stated complaints of swelling at the end of 3 weeks that appeared like an abscess, but later was proved to be an infective pyogenic granuloma on histology. It was managed with drainage of the swelling and systemic antibiotics and steroids. So as we all know, a pyogenic granuloma is a mass of highly vascular inflamed granulation tissue that's neither pyogenic nor a granuloma as such. And it's recognized complication of many ocular surgeries, especially involving the transconjunctival incisions like blepharoplasty, pterygium excision, chalazion excision, placement of silicone plugs, and eye muscle surgery. These lesions are usually treated with topical steroids, and if they fail to resolve, they are amenable to resection. In our case, the possibility of a subconjunctival abscess, subclinian or scleral abscess cannot be really ruled out, but these usually present within a week of surgery with definitive symptoms of severe pain, discharge, signs of inflammation like tenderness, erythema, swelling, or fever. Also, one retrospective study found the incidence of post-op infection to be as low as 0.14%, and only 5 confirmed cases of pediatric subconjunctival subcutaneous abscess are reported in literature. Probably because of the strict aseptic precautions that we take during surgery, like the use of povidone iodine in the conjunctival fornix, or the use of proper post-op topical antibiotic coverage. Other differentials could be infected sutural abscess or granuloma, but that usually occurs as a painful swelling with granulation tissue, and overlying loose suture would be there. But so hence that is ruled out in our case. So the cause of conjunctival pyogenic granuloma is not very clearly understood, although they say that chronic infection with Staphylococcus aureus could be one of the causes. So we believe in our case, probably a chronic infection with Staphylococcus aureus has resulted in the formation of conjunctival pyogenic granuloma that was only responsive to an aggressive treatment with fortified antibiotic and steroid application. And we found that in cases of recurrence, as in our patient, topical fortified antibiotics work really well. So I can say that pyogenic granuloma is a rare complication of squint surgery that's, although relentless and tricky to treat, responds very well and resolves completely with aggressive antibiotic and steroid regimens. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for nice presentation.
Thank you, sir.
So it is quite interesting, like what was, on exploration. Usually it is always better when you are trying to drain these abscess. It's better to explore and see around the, the muscle and the sclera, because as you said, the literature, there are reports of scleral melt or, the muscle, I mean the abscess.
Yes, sir.
So was the cautery used? Because cautery has also shown to be, one of the reason for these patients to present with granuloma or necrosis.
We don't use cautery usually, sir. Not much of cautery is used, not in this case.
Okay.
Trying to avoid as much as possible.
Okay, what were, the other antibiotics they were sensitive for this particular?
So it was mainly vancomycin, sir, and linezolid. So that's how we started the patient on topical fortified vancomycin as well as systemic vancomycin, followed by linezolid oral.
Yeah, I'm sure there might be a cefazolin also, because cefazolin is very easily available. We can use fortified cefazolin,
okay,
which is of the same spectrum, right? And they do have a good outcome. But I think waiting for 10 days just on, the topical antibiotic, even if they are, we are using those which are sensitive with such a large granuloma or for that matter abscess, it would be prudent to go ahead with, the immediate drainage. Because as a basics, we learn whenever there is a collection of a pus, it is better to drain it.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, any comments from other judges?
No. You already made the point that I wanted to make. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to the next presenter, Dr. Jinal Gore.
Sir, Dr. Shashikala is back, sir. We'll start.
Okay, so let's finish it off with Dr. Shashikala. Dr. Shashikala, please go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry, I had to finish another session. That's why I had
Yeah, that's fine. Absolutely fine. Please go ahead.
I'll just share my slide. Yeah, my slide is visible.
Yes, ma'am, it is visible. You can
Hello,
start.
sir.
Yes.
My paper is on effectiveness of prisms.
Okay, no? Okay, sir.
Effectiveness of
Fine.
prisms in the management of diplopia in patients with diverse etiology.
Oh,
Prisms are prescribed for patients who have symptomatic binocular diplopia as an optical correction. We aim to study the success of prisms in regard to diplopia resolution score and the associated factors. This is a retrospective descriptive cohort study done among patients who have prescribed prisms for diplopia for different etiologies over a broad range of ocular misalignment between 2017 to 19. These patients who were prescribed, the inclusion criteria included those who required prisms for 4th, 3rd, 6th nerve, thyroid-related, restrictive strabismus, decompensated phoria, and so on, and followed up for 2 months. We excluded patients who refused prisms due to dissatisfaction. Things that were recorded were the demographic profile of the patient, the features of diplopia, the nature, onset, duration, systemic illness, and etiology, measurement of primary deviation both for primary near and distance and down gaze, prismotherapy details about the amount and the type of prisms and the compliance. The subjective score of 1 was given for complete resolution, 2 for partial resolution, and 3 for non-resolution. Success of prisms was defined as score of 1 and 2. Coming to the results, we had 54 patients in this study duration who had symptomatic diplopia. Of them, 31 had been taken into the study after meeting the inclusion criteria. The mean age was 37, 77% were male. Mean duration of diplopia was 11 months. Mean follow-up was 15 months. Of these patients with systemic illness, 71 had no systemic illness, 13 had thyroid. This table shows the etiology. 7 patients had decompensated phoria, 4 for thyroid-related, 4 for 4th nerve, 2 patients with 3rd nerve, 6 received prisms for 6th nerve, and 8 had post-trauma. Of these patients, 2 had orbital diplopia following orbital toma, post-RD surgery, post-orbitotomy, and post-traumatic cataract surgery who had developed sensory exotropia. Type of deviations, 39% had esotropia, 51 had exo, and 19% had hypertropia. Table on the right up shows the mean deviation for horizontal distance and near. 29% had received ground glass and 17 received prisms in the form of a Fresnel prism. The mean prism that was prescribed for the study group was 13.3, ranging from 4 to 25. So 16 patients had received horizontal, 8 received vertical, 4 received combined prisms, 3 received oblique. Coming to the success, in our patients, 52% had complete resolution of diplopia following the prism usage, and 36 had partial and 13 had no resolution. Score 1 and 2 accounted for 87% who had success of prisms and resolution of diplopia. Of these patients, 96.8% opted to continue the usage of prisms. Coming on to the correlated factors between the success of prisms and the type of prisms, it was found to be significant that horizontal prisms and the oblique prisms gave 100% and it was statistically significant. The other factors like success of prisms with association of type of prism that was with the history of trauma with the type of deviations did not show any statistical significance. Coming to the discussion, so our study had 87% of patients who reported to have satisfaction with prisms. Similarly, Tamankar et al., which is the other study which denotes success of prisms among patients with various etiologies of diplopia, who had studied 94 patients, reported 88% of complete resolution success of prisms. Similar study by Flader et al., 80% had experienced relief of diplopia with prisms. In our study, we had 100% success among the patients with etiology of decompensated phoria, 4th and 6th nerve palsy. Similar study was seen by Nina and Tamankar et al. Our study had 100% success with oblique prisms when prescribed. In Tamankar et al., 86% of patients had success with oblique prisms. It is quite challenging to prescribe prisms in the form of oblique when we incorporate the vertical and the horizontal component. Using the Renenke et al. Table helps us to calculate it in a better way. To conclude, prisms are effective in alleviating diplopia over a broad range of different etiologies for double vision. We recommend prisms have to be tried as an initial management for all patients with symptomatic diplopia. These are my references. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Shashikala, being on time. So I think, looking at the sample size, the statistics in terms of like presenting mean with plus minus standard deviation, it would be better to present as a median with, the range, because your sample size is very small. Okay, and it is very difficult to comment, like even looking at 86% what is being reported, when particularly those patients who had strabismus due to the cranial nerve palsies. So the temporal, the improvement of the palsy itself would contribute to the improvement in the diplopia, rather than your prism correction, isn't it? So I think that that bias is always there. So I think that should be also reflected in one of the limitation of your work or the presentation. Yeah, Dr. Morekar, you want to add?
Yeah, you already saying everything that I want to say.
Oh, yeah, please.
Yeah, I have nothing to add. You've already said what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Yes. So what was just, out of, the curiosity, what was the patient you selected? I guess, those who has completely recovered and then, you tried the prism.
Completely recovered palsy. Sir, who had symptomatic diplopia, who had measurable prisms and who were improving with the prisms, those were the patients who have selected. So after the study, what we have learned is, even though the patients aren't comfortable with the initial trial, but it is always better to give them a trial of prisms and then see, because you never know. That's the reason why we have most of the patients who are in the younger group compared to the other studies. So now we have gone ahead and tried encouraging patients, though in the initial trial phase in the orthoptic clinics, even if you feel it is a little uncomfortable for choosing a head position, there will be some head position where they can adopt a little bit, and then try with the prisms. That's why now we have started encouraging for the older patients as well. So the acceptance has increased. If you see, the number of patients were 54, but only 31 we had given prisms. So the remaining patients, we should be in a process of encouraging them, give a trial at home, some environmental situation at home, and their head positioning definitely will make them a little bit more comfortable rather than numbing them.
Sorry to interrupt, ma'am. The time is up.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
have to move on.
Thank you
Sorry
for your justification for that. So let's move on to the next speaker. We have Dr. Jinal Gore.
Good morning, sir. Good morning, everyone. My topic is clinical profile of childhood exotropia in a tertiary eye care center. I had no financial disclosures. So as we all know, exotropia is a manifest outward deviation of eyes seen in 1 to 2% of pediatric population. When these children are left untreated, they're at increased risk of amblyopia and thus contribute to childhood visual impairment. So aim of our study was to study the prevalence of various types of exotropia presenting to our clinic and also to know the age of onset, age of presentation, various ocular and systemic associations. It was a cross-sectional prospective study with a 15-month duration. Inclusion of patients with clinical diagnosis of exotropia of age less than 16 years and exotropia of more than 10 prism diopters was done. The patients with a history of strabismus surgery, consecutive exotropia, and patients who were lost to follow-up were excluded. So out of the 286 study patients which were enrolled, we found that there was no gender predilection, but previous studies have shown that there is a female preponderance which is seen. Coming to types of exotropia, intermittent exotropia was the most common form, as we all know, and CNS associated were the second most common, then was infantile, sensory, restrictive, and paralytic types. A high number of cases of exotropia with neurological association were present, that is 11%, out of which developmental delay and hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy were most common. Reason of such a high number of cases was damage to brain during critical period of development. Median age of onset was found to be 24 months and age of presentation was 60 months. Most of the patient had no significant refractive error and myopia was the most common refractive error which was seen. And 12% cases had a pattern association and V pattern being the most common. Also, amblyopia was present in 13% cases and large number of them being sensory and paralytic exotropia. DVD was seen in 11%, inferior oblique overaction in 8%, and nystagmus in 8%. On Bird's 4-dot test, we found that binocular single vision was present in 36% for distance and 56% for near. Cases of intermittent exotropia had better fusion for distance and near compared to other types. Central stereopsis was seen in 18%, peripheral in 60%, and absent in 22%. Coming to the subtypes of intermittent exotropia, we found that basic exotropia was seen in majority of cases. Also, Kelhoun's phases, phase 2 and 3 constituted majority of cases, and in office control, around half of the cases showed a poor control for distance and good control for near. So to conclude, we found that there was no gender preponderance in our studies, whereas female predilection is seen in previous studies. There was a relatively later age of onset. Myopia was the most common refractive error. Large number of cases had a neurological association. Cases of exotropia with neurological association were significantly associated with preterm delivery and low birth weight. And intermittent exotropia was found to be the most common form of exotropia. Majority of these cases were seen in phase 2 or phase 3. And nearly 50% of patients had a poor control for distance and good control for near. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for a nice presentation. So what is, you are adding new to the literature out of this study. It's quite interesting, but, if I could see everything is being known,
Yes, sir.
and it is not surprising for me to see like intermittent XT being the most common, and then the stereopsis has shown more improvement or something like that, which is very obvious. So what new thing you want to add with this study?
So we wanted to know that what is the kind of presentation of patients which we seen in our clinic. Usually these studies are from Western literature and Caucasian population. So we wanted to know what is the type of profile of patients that we get. So we found neurological association which was present in exotropia cases also. It is usually found that esotropia cases have like cases with neurological anomaly, developmental delay are more commonly having esotropia as an anomaly, but also in exotropia we found that 11% cases we had. And also for the like we have a relatively later age of onset, around 2 years in our patients as compared to other previous studies. So maybe the later age of onset is due to the social taboo related to the exotropia, to the squint that is there in our population. Or this shows that there is some hesitancy of patients to show to the clinic, and maybe we can target screening of patients, younger children, or some program that we can establish to screen these kind of children. And we need more awareness so that these patients are treated early and have a good outcome.
Yeah,
Also,
so
we
interesting. Yes, so
yes, sir.
the most interesting thing probably what you can highlight out of your study is, the neurological association. So usually they are
Yes, sir.
very much less reported, like I don't find any study as far as, the Asia or India is concerned. So how much was like, how many you had patients with, underlying optic atrophy, or they turn out to be HIE or some sort of tumors or something like that? How many
Yes, sir.
percent? You said 11, but which entity is one of the most common in those patients? Because I'm sure, we don't do a routine neuroimaging, that too, particularly in exotropia,
Yes,
right?
sir.
And majority of your group was intermittent, so definitely no way. But if already, from the same institute, the Sovita has
Sorry to
presented,
interrupt,
right?
sir.
So
Yes.
We
the
have to move on.
exotropia, congenital exotropia, so how many had the neurological deficit in your study out of those 11% which you are talking about?
And
So
what kind of
HI,
deficit?
so for the causes
The time is
development,
up. If you could just give your answer in the chat, we'll be moving
Yeah,
on to the next
yes,
session.
sir, sure.
Yeah.
yeah, we can move to
Thank you.
the next presenter.
Thank you.
So let's move on. Dr. Mahesh Bajantri. Dr. Mahesh, are you around?
Sir, the next speaker is Dr.
Hello, sir.
Alexander.
Yeah, we can take Dr. Alexander, no problem.
Good morning to all, sir. Can you see my presentation, sir? Hello.
Yes,
Yes,
we can
Dr. Alexander, we can hear you and we can see your slides very well. Yeah.
So good morning to all, sir. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to present on the topic discussing the tumor-inducing eye disfigurement. There is no financial disclosure. Strabism is the misalignment of visual axis of the eye, prevalence of 4 to 6%, just affecting over 350 million people worldwide. Visually, it affects the binoculation of patients, causing amblyopia, diplopia. Cosmetic deformation due to strabismus lowers the emotional quotient of the patient. Mental health disorders were diagnosed in 40.3% patients suffering from squint. 35. Here I am going to about the patient who come to the OP, 35-year-old male, comprehensive deviation and loss of vision in the right eye since 1 year. He undergo surgery of meningioma 1 year back, and the details are we didn't get because of the flood. He lost his medial histories and everything. And examination, there is a visual acuity in the right eye is PL negative, and the left eye is 6/9. The anti-segment examination showed presence of ptosis and RAPD. And evaluation of extraocular movement show restriction of adduction and depression in the right eye. Then fundus examination, optic atrophy in the right eye. we can see the extractive movement in the right eye. There is a reduction in the abduction and the depression. We can appreciate. And an oculoplastic cosmetic procedure was performed in 2 stages in different days. And the first stage will be lateral rectus and inferior rectus recession. That recession slackens the muscle by moving it away from its insertion. And the second stage, superior rectus, it is done after 1 month. Superior rectus and middle rectus resection, and resection shorten a muscle to enhance its effective hold. So here, stage 2, the photo picture is shown. In this case, despite the fact that vision in the affected eye cannot be restored, strabismus, the procedure were undertaken on the perspective of restoring cosmetic appearance of the eye. Considering the young age of the patient, the restoration of the cosmetic appearance will play a positive role in social and emotional well-being, justifying the need for surgery. Economic factors and lack of awareness among medical communities also contribute towards delay in treatment. Despite the risk of anterior segment ischemia in surgeries of multiple recti, the risk of justifying considering the psychological benefit of the patient after correction. A risk of oculocardiac reflux causing sinus bradycardia in omnipresent is case of strabismus surgeries should be looked out for. In terms of wedding proposal, squint always remains as a factor of stigma. In case of where the vision cannot be restored, providing the patient with a better cosmetic correction will improve the quality of life, mainly by boosting his emotional quotient. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for presentation. And your case is trying to highlight that how the strabismus is cosmetic blemish and we can correct it. But I have a major concern, like as a strabismus specialist, touching to the pore muscle and the risk of anterior segment ischemia over the cosmetic
Yes,
correction is very, very important. Okay, so
Yes.
anterior segment ischemia is more worrisome than the cosmetic outcome, especially when we do have the other surgical approaches that are very much available in the literature, and nowadays that has become a standard of care. So in this particular case, probably it's like one can split lateral recti far posterior into the orbit and then transpose that to the the medial rectus, and then you can add on doing both superior and inferior oblique myectomies, and if required you want additional effect, you can always transpose the superior oblique to MR. Or there are other options where rather than doing fore muscle with recess resection, you can do a subperiosteal fixation of LR and then dismantle the effect of LR and then add on other transposition procedures to make the strabismus, the good alignment in primary position.
Yes, sir.
So I would like to ask one more thing. Since
sir.
you're not sticking to what is routinely done, like what is being suggested by one of the judges, was a ethical clearance taken for a particular deviation here? Did you take an ethical clearance for this case?
Sir, this I am not publishing, sir. Just for that case of the discussion of this surgery and due to the cosmetic procedure, I have done this. Yes, sir.
So what I am trying to say is that ethical clearance you don't take only for a publication or
Yes, sir,
presentation.
sir. For
We
publication,
are doing
before you
a
have taken, sir.
deviation from what is normally routinely done, and
Yes, sir.
that too with the purpose of cosmesis. We don't only take the permission of the patient, but we also take an ethical clearance that this is what is routinely done. So we are going to change routine practice. So did we ask the ethical committee or something like that?
Yes, sir. That one, when we publish, we have to. We have already taken things, sir. I have got, sir.
So you're going to take it, or for the publication, or you've already taken?
No, sir. I have to take, sir.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, so if we have a time, I think you should, review some literature on how to deal this group of patients. There's a very nice surgical intervention from Linda Dagi and group from Harvard. You can refer that article. And even, there are the series being reported by Dr. Rohit Saxena and group. So please refer those articles for.
Okay, sir. Sure. Sir.
Let's move on to the next speaker, Dr. Leela Mohan.
Yes, sir.
Please share your slides. Yeah.
Can you?
Yes, we can see your slides. Yeah, please go ahead.
Anterior plagiocephaly or unilateral coronal synostosis is associated with underacting superior oblique and inferior oblique overaction on the side of the synostosis. This is due to the flattening of the forehead on the same side and asymmetric bossing of the forehead on the opposite side. Though molding helmets or cranial surgery early in infancy can be effective in correcting it, often child is brought much later when the squinting becomes apparent, and the asymmetry is due to ocular plagiocephaly. Ocular features are flattening of the forehead, eyebrow on that side is raised, superior orbital rim is depressed, X-ray skull shows classic harlequin deformity, and correction of the ocular torticollis can improve the facial asymmetry if surgery is undertaken quite early. These are the ocular features. And underaction of the superior oblique is due to desagittalization. We can see this child with the right lateral, right plagiocephaly. There is head tilt and face turn to the left, and the tip of the nose is deviated towards the left. All these are due to the ocular plagiocephaly, which is due to the constant face turn or head tilt due to the strabismus, which was termed by Greenberg as ocular plagiocephaly. It's classically seen in superior oblique paresis, and it can be assessed by measuring the distance between the lateral canthus and angle of mouth between the two sides. And we did an observation study among patients who presented with hypertrophy and plagiocephaly during the period from 2008 to 2014. Detailed examination with visual acuity, strabismus measurement with PBCT or Krimsky assessment of facial asymmetry by measuring the distance between the lateral canthus and the angle of the mouth, and fundus extortion was done. Lateral canthus to angle of mouth on either side were done before surgery and every year thereafter for a minimum of 4 years. And photos were also taken to look for the abnormal head posture subjectively. There were 6 girls, 2 of them were sisters and 2 boys, mean age was 54 months, and 5 were right-sided, 3 left-sided. Mean hypertropia was 23 prisms in primary position. 2 had exotropia of mean 18 prisms. Inferior oblique overaction varied from 2+ to 4+. All had head tilt to opposite side. 6 had face turn also to the opposite side. And fundus showed extorsion of the globe in all patients, and the canthus to angle mouth was 1.9 millimeter. The flattening of the face and abnormal head posture and deviation of the tip of the nose was also appreciated in the photos. Surgery was done for all, and 5 had inferior oblique recession, and 3 had 4+ inferior oblique overaction and had anteriorization of the inferior oblique. 2 had lateral rectus recession as well. Mean hypertropia reduced to 5.3 prisms, and mean canthus to angle of mouth was 0.6 millimeter. Measurement from canthus to angle of mouth reduced by 1.4 millimeter over 3 to 4 years, and extortion of fundus abolished. The abnormal head posture disappeared completely in 6 patients. That is, in 75% of the patients, the abnormal head posture had disappeared completely. This child, immediately after postoperative period, he had abolishment of abnormal head posture, and we can see the pre and postoperative after 5 years, the facial asymmetry has improved a lot. So coming to discussion, often the facial asymmetry associated with unilateral coronal synostosis is taken for granted, neglected till much later, and associated ocular problem is not recognized unless looked for the abnormal obtrude. And this ocular plagiocephaly adds to the already existing orbital asymmetry, exaggerating the facial asymmetry. And we know that if the head tilt is in congenital superior oblique palsy is corrected early enough, the facial asymmetry can be completely abolished. And early recognition of the strabismus produced due to the desagitilization of superior oblique and its underaction in anterior plagiocephaly is important, and addressing the secondary overaction of inferior oblique can reduce the facial asymmetry produced by the ocular plagiocephaly, which is induced. Thank you. These are my references.
Yeah, I think that's quite interesting, Dr. Mohan. Yeah, so I think we hardly had, the literature from this part of the world that we talk about, the strabismus in craniosynostosis. Just out of curiosity, like, what was the age of, the mean age for, they had undergone the correction for craniosynostosis?
Actually, none of them had any cranial intervention done. When we did surgery, the mean age was 54 months. And the superior oblique palsy per se producing facial asymmetry we have seen done earlier, but these patients come quite often later than later to the strabismologist rather than.
Okay, I am also of, concern about, how's their neuro-ophthalmology examination, like how was the optic nerve in these group of patients,
All these patients had completely normal neuro. We always took a neuro evaluation just to see whether they are planning to do anything, because it is already late. Actually, any cranial deformational intervention should be done during infancy.
Yeah,
so it's usually clear that you can go ahead with surgery. That is when we do, and we usually have because posterior part, there is no involvement of the optic nerve as such, because it is anterior coronal synostosis producing a flattening and retrusion of the forehead and trochlea.
Yeah, so for the similar reason, they do have palpebral fissure changes.
So time is up. We have to move on to the next. I'm really sorry for this.
Yeah, that's fine. Let's move on to the next speaker.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, Dr. Rama Kalantri. Yeah.
Yeah. Is my screen visible, sir? And am I audible?
Yes, Dr. Rama, you are audible.
Yes.
You can see.
Okay. So good morning, everybody. I'm Dr. Rama Kalantri from Pune, and I shall be sharing my initial experience of managing monocular elevation deficiency, that is MED, of various etiologies. I don't have any financial disclosure. So MED is a unilateral defect of upgaze with ipsilateral ptosis. The causes could be congenital, which could be due to supranuclear defects, primary superior rectus paresis, or inferior rectus restriction, or they could be acquired due to cerebrovascular diseases, midbrain tumors, or sarcoidosis. So my first patient was a 24-year-old male who presented with drooping of the right upper eyelid and outward deviation of either eye since birth. On alternate prism cover test, he measured 45 prism diopters of L over R with 30 prism diopters of exotropia. So diagnosis of right-sided MED was made. He was planned to undergo stage strabismus surgery followed by ptosis correction. The force reduction test was negative for inferior rectus, and hence augmented NAPS procedure was planned in the right eye. At 3 months of follow-up, he measured 25 prism diopters of L over R with 30 prism diopters of exotropia on APCT with slightly improved elevation. This patient awaits next surgery. The second patient was an 8-year-old boy who presented with drooping of the right upper lid since 2 months of age following dog bite over the right periorbital area. On modified Krimsky, he measured 35 prism diopters of L over R. This boy was amblyopic in the right eye with hyperopic astigmatism, and his best corrected visual acuity was 6/36. The CT scan of orbits showed displaced fracture of the superolateral wall of the right orbit opposing the right lobe. So the plan was to perform strabismus surgery in a staged manner as required, followed by ptosis correction. Again, the FDT was negative for inferior rectus, and augmented NAPS procedure was performed in his right eye. At 6 months of follow-up, he measured 16 prism diopters of L over R with modified Krimsky. And then the parents of the patient were not further interested in the surgical correction for strabismus, and hence they underwent the further ptosis correction at 9 months after the first surgery, which was LPS resection in the right eye. This is how he looked after 1 month of ptosis correction. So ocular injuries reported due to dog bite include lid lacerations, canalicular avulsion, ptosis from levator transection, facial nerve damage, medial rectus rupture, and orbital fractures. There is also a case of isolated superior rectus injury by dog bite, which was managed by NAP procedure, but it did not present with ptosis. In conclusion, the etiologies in both the above cases were different, one being congenital and the other post-traumatic following a dog bite, which itself is a rare case. However, since both presented like MED without inferior rectus restriction, both were managed by augmented NAPS procedure. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for sharing those two cases. So what is the new thing you want to add here? I mean, other than, the mode of injury, which you found to be rare, which is not.
Yes, sir. So yes, first thing, the congenital ones are most commonly, which we generally come up with. And this, the second patient was a different etiology. Actually, so this was the initial, this experience was like the first year of my clinical practice in which I saw these two cases. So I thought I could just present my experience.
Yeah, so what was the duration, like when they presented to you? Because, the IR tightness at such an early presentation would be very unlikely until and unless, it's a long standing, and then, even if it is superior rectus palsy, over a period of time, the antagonist would go into a contracture. So there, if they present later, then probably you need to, touch the inferior rectus, along with definitely, the transposition of nowadays, like either MR or LR to SR with modification suture. So
Yes.
what was the duration when they presented to you? Because otherwise you would get IR, on FDT, it will not be tight.
Yes,
So
sir.
what was the
Somehow in both the
presentation?
patients, the IR was not very tight. Now this patient with congenital MED had presented at 24 years of age for the first time. And the other one had this injury, and then he presented, he was an 8-year-old while he presented.
So again,
almost,
what
so
was
it's a long
the
duration.
what was the elevation limitation in this first and second case?
So the elevation is restriction was like I showed in the pictures. Like you want the exact number?
Yeah, I mean, was it like -4, -3?
So -3 is somewhere. Almost both.
Okay. Yeah, because usually when the IR is not tight, then I would anticipate more gross elevation limitation, like not crossing even midline, -4 or worse than that. If at all, it's a supranuclear palsy. But if you look at the literature, even in supranuclear palsies, over a period of time, IR becomes tight, and that is how the standard approach for this patient is on table FDT on IR and then take
Yes,
a call.
sir.
So
Yes,
we
sir.
do
Both the
find
patients,
tightness
yes,
with this.
both the FDTs were done on table, and it was not such a very gross restriction of the inferior rectus.
You need to also talk about like the ptosis, whether it is true ptosis, pseudotosis, and whether that is associated with the Bell's phenomenon. How's the Bell's?
Yes, sir.
All those factors are very, very important to take a surgical decision and ultimate outcome.
Yes, sir.
That's nice.
Thank you,
Let's
sir.
move on to the next case. If there is no comment from
I think you already said
Dr. Morekar here. Yeah.
You're already saying what I want to say. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So we have the next speaker, Dr. Sajan Dev Kesar.
I think we don't have the next two speakers, sir.
Okay. Okay. Dr. Neha Sachdeva?
No, sir.
Okay, so both of them are absent. Okay.
Yes, sir. So if there is any discussion that you want to have, you can just take like about for next 5 minutes, you can discuss if you want to, conclude or something with that.
Yeah, so I think, we had very diverse, the group of the subject presentations as far as strabismus is concerned. So which is quite interesting, and one of the most interesting what Dr. Leela Mohan has presented, which is not being much talked about, this group of cohort about craniosynostosis. So I just wanted to add, Dr. Mohan, like these patients, they do have the palpebral, the aperture changes. So probably you could have noticed in this patient, other than, like moving of tip of the nose to the opposite side. And I think as a strabismus specialist, we should be encouraging the neurosurgery group to early intervention. So there are a lot of modifications that has gone as far as neurosurgery is concerned, like endoscopic suture correction versus, the like frontoorbital advancement they do very commonly.
Very true. I have been inquiring even up to Bangalore, someplace in the where they do fronto-orbital advancement, but very few surgeons specialize in that. Actually, there is a small subspecialty itself for this craniofacial deformational deformities, where they can do a lot before infancy or up to 18 months is what they say, that if any intervention can be done. But often they come much later. They take it for granted that this is an abnormality, congenital anomaly. So they come later and they are not taken up.
Very true. Yeah. So I think if there are, yeah. Yes. So if there are no any further comments, or if any speaker they would like to ask questions, we have 2 to 3 minutes. We are more than happy to answer. Yeah. So if no questions and no comments, so and with the absence of last 2 speakers, I think we will conclude this session here. So thank you so much for your the efforts to present your work in this interesting forum. Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you, Padam, for coordinating and making it more smooth.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. I thank all the speakers for the wonderful presentation and both the judges for their valuable time. Thank you so much. Now we come to end for the